Um, before we delve into this question of, why should Christianity be accepted as the only way to God, and I'll give you a little break. I realize it's right after lunch, you guys are tired, people are going to fall asleep, and so I think it's good if we, dialogue in smaller groups. The root of this question, and this is one of those things I'm sure all of you have heard, right? Why is Christianity the only way? And the opposite end of that questioning is, don't all religions lead to the same place? Right? How many of you guys have heard this argument? Right? And it's something we'll all have to wrestle with to one degree or another, especially on our campuses. If you live in any city here in the United States, you'll find people who hold to this doctrine, no matter what area of faith they might be from. And surprisingly, what we are seeing more and more is that even Christians hold to this view as well, right? Christians who call themselves evangelical believers of Orthodox faith say, there are multiple paths. Christ is not the only way. In a recent poll, over 50% of those who cited themselves as evangelical Christians said, there are multiple ways. Right? All religions essentially lead to the very same mountaintop. And where does that come from? Right? Where does that kind of reasoning and thought come from? In my attempt to understand, this generation, we have people a little older than you at our church, people in their mid-20s, and I'm trying to figure this generation out. And so I asked this brother, why do you think people accept this view when you know that all of the religions are, in essence, mutually exclusive, right? They all say different things about who God is, and they all, in one regard or another, say, this is the only path. And this young man said to me, I think the problem with our generation, I think he's very astute in terms of being self-aware. He says, we're not all that good at thinking critically. Logical thought has been dismissed. Why? Why is it that this proper reasoning has been dismissed? And it comes down to kind of the laziness of our generation, meaning it's far easier to believe, right, that truth is relative. There is no truth. And so what's the point of working so hard to go after it? Right? It's easier to say, everything is relative. Truth is unknowable. And so if that's the case, then I don't have to really do my homework, right? I think ultimately that's what it comes down to. I think there was a young man here that talked about epistemology, right, which is the study of knowledge and the limits of knowledge. How do we know what we know, and how can we be certain of those things, right? And piggyback on epistemology is another field of philosophy called metaphysics, right? What's the essence of being? What's reality? All of those different things. And you just hear those two words, and what ends up happening? Like your mind shuts off, right? I know my mind does, right? Whenever someone throws those kind of words around, I feel like, that's boring. I'm done, right? Let's not think about those things. Tell me, some inspiring stories so that I could be emotionally motivated. But at a certain point, we have to do our homework, right? We have to sit down and then think about epistemology. We have to think about metaphysics. We have to reason things out and do the homework and not simply assume that everything is true because we see it on Facebook and on the internet, right? It's surprising how many people assume that everything that's written on the internet is true, but what is written in the scriptures is false, right? It makes absolutely no sense to me. And, that's something we have to combat. And, in terms of, where, this has its root in its foundation. And many people will not say that they're atheists, but much of our world is based on philosophies that have been derived from atheism, right? And that's why we opened up with a defense of atheism, or actually an apologetics against atheism. And if you think about it, there's three people who have really formed the philosophy and our perspectives on life. And I think this is a scary thing, right? That a few thinkers can actually move a culture, right? It's not many people. As long as they're influential and as long as their thoughts make some sort of coherent sense, they're able to move a society and a culture forward. And in Western thought, there's three figures, actually four figures, that have really pushed things forward. Darwin, obviously, right? People, if you've gone to school, you know that the theory of evolution has changed much about the way we think about God, the way we think about the world. The second might be a little less famous. His name is Ludwig Feuerbach, a philosopher in the 1800s, who essentially piggybacked off of Darwin's thoughts to some degree, and he said, you know what, God is a projection of the human consciousness, right? It's something that we have made up because we need something, right? Something is unfulfilled in us, and so we're projecting a God through our human consciousness, and this is why God is so man-like, right? Why we have what we call the anthropomorphic view of God. Right, because we're projecting our needs as people. The third person, you probably know him, Karl Marx. Right? Very influential, whether you realize it or not. Right? And what's the famous statement from Karl Marx? What is religion? What is religion? The opiate of the masses. Right? It is the opiate of the masses, meaning it is a way for the man to hold you down. Right? It's how an unjust system holds down the lower caste, essentially, right? And this was when Orthodox was big, when Catholicism was big in France, and so he was saying this is a way to subdue the poor so that they won't rise up and revolt, in essence, right? And then from that we also have a man by the name of Freud, who essentially said, God is a projection of our wishes. He's a wish fulfillment, in essence. We want him so desperately that we will make him up, right? And we will believe a lie. And so those three atheists, in essence, have formed Western thought. And from that, we have three waves of thought that have really significantly changed the way we view the world. And, a lot of you guys, you might not be all that concerned about philosophy or theology, but the thing is, everyone swims in it, right? Meaning, it's all around you. You can't avoid it, right? You have a philosophy of life, even though you can't state it explicitly. All of you have a theology, even though you can't explain it explicitly. Every single person in the world, you can't be a human being, without having a theology, without having a philosophy. And there are three ways of thought that have essentially dictated the way we think in the Western world. Right? One is modernism, right? The idea that everything can be explained scientifically. Right? Science is what matters. Reason and evidence and proof at the scientific level, what we see with our eyes, right, is the only thing that ultimately matters. And so we obviously have that permeated in our classes, and it's important. I'm not saying you should discount all your science classes, right? You should be good students and do well on your science classes. But that's transcended beyond our classrooms to the way that we think. Where do you think materialism comes from? Right? It comes from a scientific view of the world, right? That all I have is what I see, and there is no life after this. The immaterial is inconsequential. And so, let me live for the here and now. And how many of you guys want that nice car, that beautiful home, right, in the suburbs, right, so that you can continue to live a good and comfortable life? I think all of us do. But the question is, why? Well, many of you will say, well, because I want my children to have a beautiful life and a house. So they can repeat this over and over and over again. And you realize, you continue down that road, your life is inconsequential, right? It really means nothing, right? And that's what materialism brings us to, or modernism. The second wave of thought is humanism, right? That man is the center of the universe, right? We are the culmination of the evolutionary process. We stand at the apex of creation itself, right? Which amazingly, the Bible does teach that as well. But in the scriptures, we are at the center. God is, right? And we stand to the side. But in humanism, man is at the center, and from that, what is the main premise of humanism? It's you live for the pleasures of life. Seek out great pleasure. And this is the Humanist Manifesto. The first one was in 1931, and the Supreme Court declared it to be a non-theistic religion, actually. And if you look at the definition of religion, what is religion? It's not simply a belief in God. It's a belief in how are we fulfilled as human beings. Where do we find our fulfillment? What is our destiny? And so they rightfully evaluated humanism as a religion of its own, essentially. And the purpose of humanism, let's live for the greatest pleasure now. Let's live for what is pleasurable. In 1973, a second part of the manifesto was given. And in it, the same things were written, but in addition to living for pleasure, lessening the pain of others, which it kind of goes hand in hand, and where a lot of people kind of gravitate towards now, right? If you say, what is your philosophy? You say, I want to live for my pleasure, meaning, I want to be rich, I want to be comfortable in life, but I also, because I'm a good person, I want to lessen the pain of others, right? I want to increase their pleasure. And so pleasure runs this whole thing. And so you have that, but in the 70s, a second manifesto came out, and this had basically the who's who of philosophy, science, some of the great minds that Francis Crick, guys that you hear about in your science classes. They all signed this, and basically what they stated was we also reject I believe the correct wording was the puritanical beliefs of faith that keep us from experiencing sexual pleasure in the way that it was meant to be experienced. And so from that, right, where do we get to? We get the free love movement out of the 60s, the 70s. We also get the acceptance of homosexuality as a lifestyle from a humanistic belief, right? And so, everything that's happening now, it ties back, to philosophy. It ties back to a theological view of the world. So this is why, at the end of the day, why these things are important for us to understand, right? And so that was two. The third one, which is very closely related, is moral relativism, right? And we live in a culture, in a world, especially here in the West, where basically we see, there is no absolute morality, right? There is no truth, therefore you cannot tell me how I should live, what I should do, right? Essentially, keep to yourself, and religion has no part in the public sphere of thought and life, right? And so, this is essentially, where we are, in terms of kind of progression of history from the 1800s, and why we come to this question of, why should we say Christianity is the only acceptable way to God, right? Isn't everything relative, right? Isn't all truth the truth of the one who beholds it? And so how can you now tell me that you say you have the one truth? And that seems dangerous to me, right? So why don't we break off into our groups, and why don't you have one or group be a devil's advocate, and the second half of the group explain why Christ should be the only way to God. All right? Well, let's do that right now. I'll give you guys about 10 minutes. I have to leave at 2:15, unfortunately, so it has to be done in about 10 minutes. Guys who are the coexistence people, don't look at this.
always be respectful of other people's so why should you I'm saying that you have about seal. These are self-evident.
there's one thing that I did forget to mention is that I think the world is the way it is oftentimes because of failure of the church. A lot of these things that are happening in our world today, even humanism, a great book that I would recommend to all of you is J.I. Packer's book, Christianity, The True Humanism. And he talks about, you know what, this type of reaction to the church, this anti-Christian reaction, only happens when churches and Christianity become legalistic, divisive, authoritarian, and unloving to the society. And, so we bear a bunch of fault, right? And so now we have to backtrack. So yeah, I mean, I think there are very little apologetics to that. This is the church's own doing. Many other thoughts, defenses for pluralism. I think that's pretty strong. How about, did you have another?
I was on the other team.
Okay, why don't you bring out the other team?
So what makes the Christian God so special? And why would this God be better than the Hindu Vishnu God or something?
Right. Okay, that's great. And I think that's where comparative religion comes in, right? And we'll talk about the differences between the world religions. I feel like a lot of people, they spout out this, what makes it different, and they just assume that every God is exactly the same, and their understanding of God is actually the Christian God, right? When they dialogue with you, they talk about a loving God, a God who's involved with our lives. But many of the world religions, they don't have that God, right? And for them to say, well, this God is no different than the God of Christianity, it is an argument from ignorance, actually. And something you want to point out, obviously, gently and lovingly. I like what was said over here. How do we do this with the spirit of gentleness, right? And with measure of, I would even say, tolerance. You do have to, I believe Christians have to be tolerant. It is sin for us to persecute. We are what was learned today. We are the lamb, right? We should be the ones being persecuted and not the persecutors. Okay. So, why should Christianity be accepted as the only way to God? As I said, popular modern view is that all religions are equal paths to the same supreme being. Okay. All religions are acceptable because they represent mankind's corporate attempts to find religious truth. This is the common arguments that are given. And another one, even if Christianity is God's only true revelation, He will still accept people from other religions because they represent sincere efforts to find Him, right? So a lot of credence is given to sincerity of effort, even though you might be sincerely wrong, right? And so it all comes back to this very subjective view of the world and of knowledge. Also, at the end of it, we realize this represents a misinformed view of the irreconcilable differences between all the world's faiths, many of them which also claim to be as exclusive as Christianity. Right? To some degree, every one of the world religions, maintain exclusivity, and so how could all of that be true? Let's contrast religions really quickly. And obviously, this is an idiot's guide to religion. Right? You got to do more homework than this. But let me just throw it out there very quickly here. Hinduism and its offshoots, New Age movement, right? Anything that's pantheistic. They view God as pantheism, which denies a personal creator and identifies God as being one in essence with nature. There is no difference, right? Like God is in everything, and He can't be divorced from what He has created. All right. Buddhism teaches that nothing exists independently or eternally. Therefore, although God exists, one should not seek divine intervention. Right? And this is clear Buddhist teaching. He wasn't, obviously, he wasn't an atheist. He believed in the Hindu God, but in essence, he lived his life out practically as an atheist. Right? This is where we get Buddhist atheism, in essence, and he taught, God is bound by the same universal laws that you and I have to observe, and so it does you absolutely no good to have Him in your being. Okay. Islam and Judaism reject the Trinitarian nature of God. To believe that Jesus is God is viewed as a blasphemous assertion. And so in saying that all three are the same, essentially you are denigrating each one, right? You're bringing each one of them down, and you're maintaining you have a greater knowledge that men and women who sincerely believe these things, right? And so for those reasons, we have to maintain the exclusive nature of Christ. Now, one of the primary arguments that's given towards this idea of exclusive path is, what about all the oppression, all the violence that's been caused by the claims of the world religions, especially Islam as well as Christianity, right? How can we reconcile all the world's problems and all the things that have happened because people have become so religious? And three solutions are generally given to this problem. One is outlaw religion, and communism. Many of you guys didn't see the Berlin Wall fall. I'm old enough to remember when the division between East and West Germany were taken down, and you realize that this idea of a totalitarian state, right, run by Marxist belief, this idea of communism, a state without God, it failed miserably. Right? It did nothing. It was the worst thing that mankind could come up with because it inherently believed in the goodness of man. Right? It says, we can do this. We can be benevolent towards one another without God evoking his moral status over us. And communism taught us that is absolutely false. And what we see is that we have seen some of the greatest human atrocities in the 20th century when we said God does not exist. In Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge, I don't know how many millions Stalin killed millions of his own countrymen, right? Because he had no morality, right? Communism is a failed experiment in essence, right? Let's condemn it, which is the second one. Create an environment where it seems uneducated, intolerant, and foolish to make any sort of exclusive religious claims. How many of you guys have ever felt that in the world that we live in now? I think this is probably the most popular one, actually. The world makes us feel this way. Like we're the bigots. And it's a very difficult position to be in. The third one is privatize religion completely. Religion should be kept out of the public sphere, not inform our decisions regarding public policy, ethics, and societal issues. And obviously that is a near impossibility. Right? If you are a Christian in the truest sense of that word, what is the most important thing in your life? Jesus. Right? It's impossible for you to divorce who you are, right? Your ethics, your morality, when you step into the public sphere. And so, in essence, in order for you to do this, every Christian would have to be excluded from courts of law, right? Would have to be excluded from, any teaching position, anything that you do publicly. Christians essentially would have to be shut out of those things. And I can't believe that anyone would, with a rational understanding of society and life and fairness, would come up with this idea of, let's try to privatize this thing completely, where you can't bring these things in. Who we are, and this goes for every religious stuff. Who we are emanates from our beliefs in God. Right? Every secular sociologist will tell you, you become like a god you worship. Yes. This is the natural way that societies are formed. And this completely negates that sociological understanding of religion and man. All right? Is there a solution? Many fundamental Christians will cite Jesus' statement that he did not come to bring peace but a sword, and they will use that to justify this ongoing tension between Christianity and the world religions. A lot of the problems that we face today, I think it comes from kind of unbridled I think we have to be very careful how fundamental we get in terms of kind of the legalistic views of the world, forcing the world to adhere to our standards, right? What does Paul say in the scriptures? I don't judge the world, right? I judge the church, and I think that's fair. Right? We judge what's within the boundaries of the church, our morality, but he says, I don't judge the world. They are who they are because they don't have God. How dare we judge them? right? And much of fundamentalism judges the world, and they defend that by saying, you know what, he just came to bring a sword, and we're just agents of that division. And I believe that's an improper use of this text. Violence and oppression, on the other hand, will continue to be a human problem, but a robust, and this is what Keller says actually, but a robust biblical Christianity teaches us to love our enemies, to forgive those who sin against us, and to recognize the image of God in the universe. I still believe and maintain that Christianity is the hope of the world, right? It will bring peace, right? It will. More so than any other faith, right? More so than secular humanism, right? This is the hope of the world. If it's robust, if it's biblical, if it's healthy and vibrant, right? And one of the things I challenge seekers and unbelievers is, give me one other thing that is a greater hope. As I talk about this man who died for the sins of the world, right? Who loved his enemies, to teach me an ethic that provides a greater hope, a better future for the world that we live in. And you know what? There isn't been one person who's been able to say, you know what, I have a better solution to this. Why? Because there isn't a better solution. Right? This is the solution we can give. At the center of Christianity, there is a Savior who was cut through with a sword, who gave his life for his opponents, and refused to continue the cycle of violence and oppression. When they say, why is this going on? We could say the church is at fault, right? Crusades, all those things. But we can also say, you know what, that wasn't a robust, healthy, vibrant Christianity. Right? And hopefully we've learned and we've grown and we're at a place now, that we're not nominal or legalistic in our faith, but we want to live this thing out the way that it was intended. There is a solution. Okay. And now going back to the question of, can anyone know truth? And ultimately, the idea of one exclusive path to God. You have to get to this place of, can anyone know the truth, right? And the postmodern view of truth consists of the following tenets, all right? There is no such thing as an objective view of reality. We are shaped by our culture, okay? Your humanities class will probably learn this. There are no facts, only interpretation, Friedrich Nietzsche. There's a lot of postmodern Christians who like Friedrich Nietzsche, I think a little too much. He's a brilliant man, but his teaching is inherently flawed. History is fiction. History is written from the bias of writers' culture, race, or gender. Michel Foucault. How many of you guys know who Michel Foucault is, by any chance? Right? Pretty prominent. He doesn't call himself a philosopher, but he is. He's essentially the founder of postmodernism. And much of what your generation sees the world as, he shaped it because he shaped so many academics. Your universities are filled with people who have sat under Michel Foucault's teaching. I'll read to you some of the things that he said later in his life. Knowledge is power. We must be suspicious of anyone who claims to have the truth. They're only out for their own vested interest. Again, Michel Foucault. There's some truth in that, actually. Knowledge is power. There is great power in it. And there are people who are out for their own vested interest. Right? I would say even religious leaders. We're not outside of that accusation. So we do have to be careful. I think his is a reaction towards unbridled authoritarianism in the church. Ethical claims are mere sentiment. We cannot call anything right or wrong. It's authority. Jacques Derrida, and we'll talk about nihilism a little bit. Deconstruction is justice. We have to annihilate everything we know to be true and false in order to get to a pure humanity. That's what he's saying. We must ferret out the contradictions in every piece of literature so that we can uphold justice and avoid injustice, right? Which is interesting, right? There's a contradiction that we'll talk about here in the way that he presents this. Now, Michel Foucault, French, obviously, but he spent a great deal of time here in the United States. He was a professor at UC Berkeley, right? Which, surprise to all of you, is a very liberal place, right? So we get a lot of interesting teaching out of Berkeley. Anyways, he taught there. While he was there, he spent a great deal of his time in San Francisco. And this is what James Miller, in his biography, The Passion of Michel Foucault, writes. Right? as opposed to the Passion of Christ. He says this. Miller writes that Foucault wanted to destroy everything that is claimed to be right in Western culture, to maintain that there are no limits, no divisions, no boundaries between good and evil, reason and unreason, subject and object. One of his mottos was be cruel, and he sometimes dwelled at length on images of cruelty in his writings. He practiced sadomasochism and anonymous gay sex in San Francisco bathhouses. Foucault often focused on the limited experience, death. Miller notes that Foucault's destruction of morality extends to nearly everything that passes for right among a great many of American left-wing academics. This is actually some order of Michel Foucault who wrote these things. His whole maintenance was, you know what, this guy who he actually admired, said, you know, he's out to destroy everything that we view to be right in our culture. Everything that has stood for the last 200 years in at least American culture, as well as thousands of years in Western or in European cultures, he wanted to annihilate, destroy it. This is where we get the term nihilist. Nietzsche was a nihilist. Many of these philosophers are nihilists. Deconstruct everything down and build things up on the basis of a non-existence of God. It's frightening if you think about it. I know that you guys aren't in, you guys are nice multiple campuses. It's nice, right? I think about having to go back to San Francisco, this weekend, and as soon as I think about it, anxiety kind of fills my heart because I know I'll have to go back. This is Pride weekend in San Francisco. There will be 1 million people in San Francisco, visitors who are there, who will celebrate, the passing of, or the repealing of DOMA, and this understanding. And should we stay out of this? I don't know. This is something I'm going to have to pray for. I know that homosexuality is sin. Where is the church's place in this? This is a point that all of us have to pray for. You cannot just glibly, put your support one way or another. I think all of us have to sit, pray, read the scriptures, read book after book, and decide what is the way that God wants us to go, while maintaining that homosexuality is sin. I do believe in the separation of church and state. Right? I absolutely believe that. And oftentimes the church is more vibrant when it is a persecuted minority. And so, in one degree, I am thankful, right, that we're getting to that place. But how persecuted we want to get, I'm not sure. Right? Does it mean, me being thrown in jail for preaching that homosexuality is sin? I'm willing to go there, right? And if that's the case, I think it'll wedge a division between nominal pastors and pastors who stand firm on the Word of God. And so that's something, I don't mind. So I think it's interesting. But we all have to pray in terms of where will we stand on this. But realize where Americans' thoughts on homosexuality come from. That there are limits to knowledge. We cannot arrive at a comprehensive knowledge of reality through reason alone. Your perspective does affect what you see. Our perspective affects the way we view history. Our ideas of God and reality are too small. Right? These are all things, right, that are being permeated, and the culture blinds us. And these, I would say, are points of agreement for us. Okay? I think as Christians, we can't be so dogmatic or so assertive that we say, we don't agree with those tenets. We agree with some of these things, right? There is truth and logic in that, right? But where is the division? The division is this, is that at the end of the day, this idea that knowledge is purely relative, it is a self-refuting philosophy. Okay? And what does this mean? C.S. Lewis, to this philosophy, he would say, is it objectively true to say that there are no objective truths? Right? Right? Is it objectively true? And this is what the relativists will say, right? I have an objective truth. But how can they say that, right, when they're saying that there is no objective truth? And this is why C.S. Lewis, and he had no idea this was coming around the corner, but he says, is it objectively true to say that there is no such thing as truth? And can you deny the validity of reason without using reason? Right? It's a contradiction in terms, and it is a self-refuting philosophy at the end of the day. If all true statements are culturally biased, isn't the claim of no objective truth also culturally biased as well? You can't stand on this yourself, right? And he talks about this idea of they're sitting on the branch that they're sawing off, right? In essence, what teaches absolute truth? Religion, right? Religion is the only thing that teaches objective truth. And what are they doing? They're sawing that part off, and they have nothing ultimately to stand on. They have nothing to stand on, and it's a self-refuting philosophy. If all meta-narratives are suspect because they are oppressive, then it is not postmodernism a meta-narrative that is equally oppressive and suspect. Is postmodernism, moral relativity, is that a oppressive and suspect philosophy of life? It's interesting how quickly we forget World War II. Right? Mussolini, Hitler, these men, they did what they did because they were moral relativists. You guys recognize that? You realize that, right? They did what they did because they didn't believe in any truth. They didn't believe in good and evil. They thought everything is culturally dictated. And for me to say the Aryan race is the primary race, right? And it is valid for us to exterminate everything that stands in our way. For them, that was morally acceptable. How do you think an entire culture, an entire nation was able to do this without any sense of guilt or moral reputation? When they stood, in front of the Nuremberg courts, their main defense was, this was acceptable for our culture. This was okay. We lived in this culture. That was their main defense. We've been down this road before, and it has never ended well. And this is essentially what C.S. Lewis said. It is a moral issue, right? You might think, this is, coexistence, we're being loving, we're going to assume. We might say that, but this becomes a moral issue. I'm starting to preach now, that's why. People deny any absolute standard. They will constantly appeal to a fixed standard of fairness. How many atheist humanists say, it's not fair, it's not just, what you're doing is unfair. And what are they saying? There's some standard out there, right? I don't even know it, I'm not logically thinking about it, but I have some sort of standard in me, right, that's been given outside of me. And the idea that there could exist a society with radically divergent morality is ridiculous. This is something that C.S. Lewis says. Moral relativists avoid using the embarrassing words good and evil with less precise, fuzzier terms that are necessary, progressive, efficient, but in reality, they're referring to their own notion of good and evil. And last thing, ethics based on preserving society or the good of humanity ultimately fail without God. Without external moral standards, the effort will go disastrously wrong. Somewhere down the line, humanism, and this is what the Anabaptist says, humanism by itself is, it's okay, right? It'll kind of hold things together for a little bit, but the problem is, without God, it morphs into something else, right? And, some of the homosexual scholars, actually, one of the things that they warn the homosexual community about is be careful of alienating Christianity, right? Because historically, they've been your protectors. They've been your protectors. Do you think, this world that is now for you, that in drop it down, they won't turn against you, right? I think, drop it down. If things go horribly wrong in society, the very society that is supporting, all of these things, it will quickly turn on this minority group. And, will then, at that point, will a robust, healthy Christianity be able to step in and say, you know what, even though we differ, right? Even though we know your life to be sin, we'll still be here for you. Why? Because in Christ, he did the same for us, right? I think we missed a golden opportunity when the AIDS epidemic hit in the 80s, right? We missed a golden opportunity to be a voice of reason for the homosexual community. But I think there will be a second chance for us as a church, right? To really reach out to this broken, lost, and hurting group of people. The change of law will not change their brokenness. Amen? It won't. It will not change the hurt and the longings of their heart. And when they recognize that and when they realize that, will we be able to step forward? C.S. Lewis on moral relativity. There is no absolute standard of good and evil, and there is no evil. One or the other has to go, either atheism or a major argument for atheism. If we equate value judgments with human feelings, we trivialize those feelings. In fact, if all we say is all we have is feelings, then our feelings become nothing. True education involves cultivating a love for justice and a hatred for injustice. Okay? The relativistic viewpoint is hopelessly consistent. The attempts to create an ethic without God is doomed to failure. And no relativist who has been given absolute power has used that power inevitably. It has never happened, and it never will. That we can be sure. Any questions? I got to head off to catch a plane. A couple of questions. Clear as mud? Yes.
Can you just go over that last question on the last slide?
What about suffering and evil?
No, it's Christianity and religion in general should be escape from this great reality. There's second to last slide.
Second, okay. If all truth statements are culturally biased. Oh, second to last, all the way down. So is Christianity simply an escape from this grim reality? Okay. Yeah, this is a whole line of thought. Let me try to share really quickly. C.S. Lewis, J.R. Tolkien. We know them to be some of the best fiction writers of our time. Narnia, Lord of the Rings. They, as they talked about their desire for fantasy, they realized, when I'm writing these things and when I'm reading these things, I feel so much more alive. This is the desires of my heart. And am I trying to escape from this reality? That was their line of reasoning. Am I trying to escape from this reality to a non-reality? Or am I trying to escape from this reality to a greater reality? And their conclusion was, like a soldier who's trying to escape from prison, fantasizes about freedom, fantasizes about life beyond the walls of his prison. He said, this is why humans are so geared towards the storyline. Right? We love the stories, we love the fantasies, the adventure, because we know deep within us that there is a greater reality to escape to. Right? I think for me that was it was a very moving argument. I don't know if it's the most logical argument. For me, it was good enough because I know all of us. We look at that. There's deep longing in the heart, and why would we long for something that doesn't exist? We want to escape to something that does exist. And their whole thought was, what we're writing about, all these stories that we're writing, right? They represent the great reality, the great adventure that waits for us on the other side of the story. Yes. It's not. Right. Because it makes you feel very, very guilty. Right. Yeah. And there's a lot of crying and suffering in Christianity. Right? You're right. That's a great point. Okay. Please talk about more of this in your small group. There's a lot of slides about suffering and pain. That's another big argument. But I have a plane to catch. So thank you guys so much. Have a wonderful time.